Hello, and welcome to The Gathering. This is April, and I will be narrating today's feature story. It has a bit of mystery, suspense, and divine intervention, so please sit back and enjoy. In the fall of 1998, I had just signed a lease on a new home that was being rented out by the former owner's brother. The house was nestled far out into the country, which didn't bother me, as I love the peace and quiet. The town was small, but welcoming, much like the residents who had lived there. I had chosen this area in particular to be closer to my best friend Sarah. Sarah and I had been best friends since childhood, and I would only be 15 minutes now away from her. We both were in our 20s at the time, and felt that we needed a fresh start on our own. As I was settling into my new place one evening, I heard the front doorbell ring. It was startling because it was almost 10:30 p.m. and I was definitely not expecting company. I slowly walked to the front door and peeked behind the blinds to see who was there. To my surprise, there was no one there. However, there was something there. On my porch sat a beautiful flower arrangement. I quickly brought them in and sat them in a vase. Tucked in the flowers was a note that simply said, "Welcome. Enjoy your stay here, but avoid the cemetery on Route 12. Trust me." Signed, the letter E. I had to reread it to myself because it was the strangest note I ever received. I wasn't sure if this was something to be concerned about or maybe just a joke being played on me. Nonetheless, I was grateful to whomever brought the flowers. The next day I decided to ask around town about the cemetery off Route 12. I have to admit, the warning I received earlier piqued my interest. So I headed into the town diner for my usual coffee. I had been frequenting the diner for the last several weeks. Nick, the owner, had given me a wave that morning and had seated me as quickly as he could. As he poured my coffee, he was making polite chit-chat and asked how I was and if I had a good weekend. And I answered his questions politely, and then I said to him, "May I ask you a question?" He nodded and said, "Yes, sure." I explained the note that I had received and asked him what was so bad that I needed to avoid Route 12 and the cemetery. He looked at me bewildered and said, "Route 12? Cemetery?" I said yes. He then said, "I've lived here my whole life and never heard anything about staying away. In fact," he said, "when I was young, the cemetery off Route 12 was a place many would go to park and party." I was disappointed, as I was hoping to get some answers that would help me make sense of the mysterious note. I finished up at the diner and thanked Nick for his time. As I was driving home, something in me wanted to go by that cemetery, despite the warning I had received. The cemetery was in a part of town I had yet to see, so I thought, why not? After all, it was broad daylight and nothing scary happens during the day, right? I first went home so I could call Sarah to see if she wanted to join me on my little excursion. After several rings, I hung up and decided I would venture out on my own. The cemetery was roughly 20 minutes east of where I lived. The ride there was quite relaxing. Being that it was fall, the summer leaves had already changed to beautiful colors. Pumpkin and scarecrows were on display, which made this trip very scenic. As I turned off of Route 12, I already could see the gates of the cemetery coming up. I pulled off to the side of the road across from the gates so I could get a better look. It definitely was old and in dire need of some landscaping. I could see broken statues and turned over stones. It was actually quite sad to see the state of the cemetery, the final resting place for so many, and by the looks of it, you could see how badly it was disrespected. I definitely was not about to go enter the gates, so I made my U-turn and I headed home. Upon arriving home, I had one message that was blinking on my answering machine. It was an old friend from college inviting me to a party that he would be throwing on Halloween night. I had to politely decline the offer. I did have prior arrangements for that night. This year, for the first time, I was choosing to stay home, hand out candy, and watch some old horror films with a few good friends. A week had passed, and I still hadn't gotten any closer to figuring out who had left the note, and why I should avoid the cemetery. At this point, I chose to put it out of my mind, as today was Halloween, and I just wanted a good time with my friends. The night had went as planned, and my friends were now gathering up their belongings to head home. After the last trick-or-treater left, I turned off my porch light and headed straight to bed. The next morning, while I was listening to the news and cleaning up from the night before, I heard the news reporter say, 2 dead, 1 injured, off Route 12. I literally was paralyzed. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. I turned around and sat down at the table, staring at the screen. I was looking at the footage from the night before. 2 mangled vehicles were shown, with police tape everywhere. And then I saw it. It was the gates of the cemetery, right off of Route 12. The accident had happened right in front of these gates. Suddenly, my body felt numb as I looked to the left of me where the note was sitting. The note that heeded the warning about avoiding the cemetery. The news reporter then went into further detail, mentioning that the car with the 2 fatalities was driving back from a party that they had attended and was hit by a drunk driver head-on. Suddenly, my phone rang, and it was my friend from college. He was in tears, asking if I had heard what happened. I was a bit confused to what he was referring to. He then went on to explain that the accident that had just happened were the 2 acquaintances that we knew from college. They were coming back from his party. Sadly, they were the 2 fatalities. I was in utter shock and disbelief, because had I went that night to the party, I would have been on that same exact road coming home. I just kept reading the note and thinking, my God, it's as if this person had a premonition and warned me. Later that day, my landlord had stopped by to fix the sink and had obviously noted something was wrong with me. He asked if everything was okay, and I said, oh yes, the house is great. I decided to vent a little. I asked him if he had heard about the accident. He nodded yes. I then decided I wanted to tell him about the note and the fact I knew the victims. He then looked at me. I could see his eyes welling up with tears. He said, may I see the note? I replied, of course. He read it, he put it down, and said, when did you receive this? I said a few weeks back, and I mentioned the flowers as well. He looked at me and said, Miss, this is my brother. I was confused, as I knew his brother passed away a few years back. He then sat back and told me his brother's name was Evan. Evan had worked at the cemetery off Route 12 for almost 25 years as the groundskeeper, and he loved nothing more than caring for the grass. During his time there, he came across the scenes of many deadly accidents that would happen right at that corner of Route 12 and the gates of the cemetery. He would often warn people, especially the new ones in town, to avoid Route 12 and that cemetery. In the last years of Evan's life, he could no longer write, so he would simply sign everything with the letter E. After he told me this, to say I was surprised was an understatement. I was speechless. He went on to say that Evan must be pleased with the way I'm caring for his home and wanted to do the same and look out for me. To this day, I'm not sure why I was spared that night. That Halloween was the first year ever I did decide to stay home. Was it a mix of fate and Evan's warning that had me stay home and decline the invitation to the party? I'd like to think so. One thing I know for sure is wherever Evan is, the grass is looking beautiful.